Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Very warm welcome from my side. I have decided indeed to show my face. The reason for doing so is because many of you show your face in your YouTube profile, and I thought, why would I not do the same? I also hope this makes the channel a little bit more personal and sets it a bit apart from other data sources that you can find on YouTube. So in today's video we will talk about local macros. I will show you how loops work and how variable lists work in Stata. I was asked in previous videos in the comments section multiple questions, and many questions were actually related to some block of code that I had written, which was a loop using a local macro. So this is why I want to make this lesson about really how local macros work, what you can use them for, how the syntax works, because the syntax is very weird, and I'll just give you a demonstration of what you can do. So let's get started. As usual, we will not just do some dry exercise with fictitious data, but instead we will use actual data. And now, as we all know, there's this situation now with coronavirus, COVID-19. So I hope you're all safe. I hope you spend a lot of time at home and learn a lot of data in that time so you can use it productively. So the data source we will work with today is from this website. It's called Our World in Data. And the data set is called coronavirus source data, and it's compiled by someone named Hannah Ritchie. I don't know her, but this person here. So Hannah Ritchie has compiled this data set for us, which we can use now. So thanks a lot, Hannah, if you ever see this. Here we have the data sets. We can download CSV or XLSX. I again go for CSV. I download this data, save it, it's done. Now, the data set is in this folder. I open it and I have a very first look at this data set. So what this shows me is different countries. You can see here in column B. And then we have a column C called date, which shows different dates. And here, starting from column D, we have the actual data. So this data set, it has the total number of cases per country per day, and also the new cases, total deaths, new deaths, etc. And there's also some data on tests, like how many tests were done in one country on one specific day. But as you can see, that data is missing, so the test data is missing in many cases. Okay, so this is just to get a brief overview of the data. I always like to just open the raw data using Excel and just have a look at it, whether it's more or less what I have expected. So to show you where we want to get with this exercise, the goal is to make graphs, and we want the graph to show the total cases of COVID-19 in the entire world, and then as well the total deaths, because unfortunately people die of COVID-19. So we open Stata and we open the do editor by typing the commands do edit, enter. And now here you see I have the do file editor opened. I now start by importing the CSV data, which I already showed you in my last video. So I click File, Import, and then text data delimited CSV, because the file that we just downloaded is in CSV format. So we click this, and then we browse and search for the data set that we had just downloaded. I click open, and now Stata loads the data set into this window to give us a preview. And as we can see, everything seems alright. The first row contains the variable names, and then here row 2, it starts with the countries, the dates, cases, etc. So we go OK, and we can see now in this little part of the window here that we have 16 variables. We imported 13,881 unique observations, and the 16 variables, we can see them here, we can see their names here. So what we do now is we hit page up, and the page up makes it so that this command here just gets input into this little window, and from here I can just Control All, Control C, and then put it into my text editor, into my do file editor. And as before, I will structure my my do file in a way that I can, if I open it later, like in a couple of months, I open the do file again and I want to remember what I actually did, so I can just have a quick look at the respective titles here. So the first one would be we would call it load dataset, and then I like to copy the source of the dataset. So I hover over the link, I right click, I go copy link address, and then paste it. So here I have the dataset. Okay, then I add here the option clear, because just to show you, let me just copy this part without the clear. If I now enter this command, I get an error message that says no. Stata tells me no, it's not going to do it because data in memory would be lost. So I want Stata to always load this dataset, so I just type clear at the end. Okay, and as you can see, it worked. Good, so that's the first line. Now I want to open a quick bracket and show you guys how to install, let's say, customized commands. You'll encounter a lot the situation that the commands that Stata already has built in the factory settings, it's not enough for what you want to do, and you want to install an extra command. And it's actually very easy. I think Stata has done this really well. So I'm going to add step 0 here. I'm going to call it install required modules, and we're going to need the module called egenmore. So we type ssc install egenmore. Of course, if you have already egenmore installed, the command egenmore, then you just skip this step. Okay, so now is a good time to save the do file for the first time. So I'm going to call this Corona, and I'm going to save it. Okay, so let's look at this line. I'm going to paste it in here. I hit enter, and now I just wait. And Stata is telling me it's checking egenmore consistency, verifying it's not already installed. Now I know this is already installed on my version of Stata, so I should soon get a message of Stata telling me that it's already installed and telling me that the installation is successful. And we need the package in our case to compute totals, because computing totals is not something that you can just do with the factory version of Stata. So here we go. I got this feedback from Stata. It tells me all files already exist and are up to date, so that's good. I'm now gonna comment this out again. This was only so you guys can really one step-by-step follow at home, and I assume that some of you might be newer to Stata. You don't have this SSC installed yet, and the SSC stands for Statistical Software Components, and it's some people very versed in Stata and in the programming language behind Stata that actually write those commands, which other people then can use for free. It's a great thing. Okay, so now again, I run this step, means I double click to highlight the entire line. I go Control D, and Stata just ran this line, so it imported this data. I go BR for browse, which opens the browser, and now I can have a look at my data. So what we want to get at, again, is we want cases and deaths. We want the totals, and our graph should in the end look something like this. So on the vertical axis we should have the total cases, the count of cases in the world, and on the horizontal axis we want to have the dates, and then we want to display two variables. One would be total cases and the other one would be total deaths. So what I do now is, as usual, I drop all the unnecessary variables. Oops, unnecessary data. Alright. And here I will start using local macros. So this is the first time we actually use a local macro. So what I will do is I will create a local macro called interesting vars. So I go local interesting vars, and you have to think of it like this. So interesting vars will contain a list of variables, and we can later adjust this list of variables, but the package is always called interesting vars. Okay, so these two, they just say I'm creating a local macro. The name of the local macro is interesting vars, and now everything that I put in now is the content of what's inside this interesting vars local macro. So I want total cases and I want total deaths. Okay, so I copy this and here we go. So with this line now I create a local macro that's called interesting vars, and it just contains two variable names, total cases and total deaths. But the step here is called we want to drop unnecessary data. So the way we do this now is we go keep. So instead of saying we want to drop most of these many variables, we just tell Stata which ones we want to keep. So in our case, we want to keep for sure the location, because that's the name of the country. We want to keep the date, but then most of the variables that follow here we actually want to drop. We just want to keep the cases and the deaths. So I tell Stata keep location and keep date, and now keep those interesting vars. Okay, so I could now write total cases, total deaths. But if I do so, I have to write two words here, and I can just use one word instead. So using the local macro here, it saves me a bit of space, it saves me time, but actually most importantly, it gives me flexibility. I will show in the very end of the video what I mean by flexibility. So now I refer to this. It's funny. Okay. Here's the sign I need. Interesting vars. Okay. So what did I do here, and why is this green? So I'm telling Stata to keep the variable called location. That's obvious. Also to keep the variable called date, and then I tell Stata to keep whatever variables are in this local macro called interesting vars. And here I have defined what's in the local macro called interesting vars. So here we say make a local macro called interesting vars. It has to contain two variables, total cases and total deaths. And then here we just tell Stata now keep location, keep date, and keep whatever is in that local macro. Okay. So now I'm just gonna highlight this, and before I execute it, let's look at the data set at the moment. At the moment we have 16 variables, and here we can see a bunch of variables. And now I just select everything, I go Control D, and as we can see now, we have only 4 variables left, which is location, because we said it should keep location. Then we have location, the variable date left, because we said keep date, and then we have the 2 total cases and total deaths left now. And why? Because here we said there's a local macro called interesting vars, and it contains those 2 variables. And then in this step here, we told Stata to keep the variables that are contained in this local macro. Okay, now let's look at the syntax here. And this is, I know this, some people made a mistake. They couldn't replicate what I did on the last video. And one person actually, and thanks a lot for that, sent me an email, which I replied to too late because I had too much work to do, and told me that it's not working, the code is not working. And then he copy-pasted what his code was. And then I realized he was just using the wrong symbols. So when referencing a local macro, I'm going to zoom in here. Okay, so here we define the macro. No special characters needed here. But here in the next slide, we reference this macro. And when you reference a local macro, you need 2 symbols, one before the macro name and the other one at the end of the macro name. And now this first symbol here, this will depend on the keyboard you use, how you generate this. But I have looked this up, and the first symbol is called a grave accent, accent grave in French. So it's the accent that, as you can see here, it goes down a little bit. Okay, this is the first accent. This is what you have to put before the macro name. Okay, it's this one. And after the macro name, you have to put a normal apostrophe. Okay, it's this sign here called apostrophe. Good. I can now close these again. And you cannot believe how much time it took me to understand that this is the way to reference macros. But once you learn it, you actually get used to it, and you can just write those symbols out pretty fast. Like, you get used to it. It's just something that you have to know. And I mean, the Stata help, in my opinion, is it does a good job in explaining this, but you have to read the help files extremely carefully to understand that, hey, they're actually talking about those symbols. Okay, so whenever you reference a local macro, you use those 2 symbols, the accent grave and then the apostrophe. All right. So what's next now? We now have only the variables that we care about. There is one last thing we have to do. The problem is that there is actually a location called world in this data set. Here we go. So there's one location called world already, and we want to compile we want to compute the totals for the world, but we want to do it by ourselves. So for the sake of this exercise, we're just going to drop all observations that are for world. And to do that, we just type drop if location equals world. And here, this is case sensitive. So if you type the W small, it's not going to work. So select this, Control D, and I can see that 120 observations were deleted. So this concludes step 2, where we drop unnecessary data. And I already showed you one use of a local macro, which here is to create a list of interesting variables. Good. Now we get to step 3, which is that we have to adjust the date variable. So if you hit D or describe, you can see that date is currently a string variable. You see it because it starts with str10, so str is always string. And the problem is that we will afterwards use a by command. So we will use something by date, which is kind of like looping over all the dates that there are in the data set. And you cannot use the by command with string variables in Stata. So we have to change the way that Stata reads this variable, but of course we still want Stata to have the correct dates. So let's look at this. So it's this column here called date. It's red, which means that it's a string variable. So we look at the logic here. So the first 4 letters are always the year, then there's a line, then there's the month, and then there's the date. Okay, so we need to understand this logic so we can basically come up with commands that just convert this into a date that's readable by Stata. So we do it like this. I'm sure there are many ways to do this, but this is just the way I prefer it. So I'm going to show you how I make this. What I will basically do is I will create substrings from this date variable. So a substring would be, for instance, here only the 2020. That's a substring. The month is a substring, and the day is a substring. So I will create substrings, and then I will destring those substrings, which means I turn them into numbers. And then I will create a new date variable that uses directly the numbers. So then I get rid of all the strings that there are. This is not really related to loops, so I'm just gonna type it out and not comment too much. So first I will generate the year, and this is substring of the variable called date. Substring starts at the first character, is 4 characters long. Then I will generate the month. Again, it uses date. Starts at 6, is too long. Day, substring, date. Starts at 9th position, is too long. Okay. So I'm just going to show you what this does. So note that now we have 4 variables: location, date, total cases, and total deaths. Now I run this command, and now we have a new variable called year, which contains a part of this date variable, namely the first 4 strings. So here I tell Stata, take the string that's in the variable called date, start at the position 1, and do this for 4 positions. And that's how I get the first 4 characters of this string, so 2020 in this field. And then I do the same for month and day. Take some try and error to get because you have to count the characters. But in the end we get this, so we have 3 new variables called year, month, day, and we can check, is it correct? Here's something: 14 February 2020, 2020 February 14. Okay, that looks good. So now the next step is I destring all these and I replace. Control D. Here we are. Same thing. 2020 February 14. You notice now everything's in black characters. That means it's no longer a string. And now I create a new date variable. I'm going to call this new date. And the formula is gen new date equals mdy, which means month, day, year. And I already called them like this, so it's month, day, year. Okay. I go Control D. Let's look at this. We get these numbers, which seems like a mistake in the beginning, but the way that Stata works is that there is some date that has the underlying number is 1. I don't know what date it is. I think it's something in the 60s or so. And that's the date called 1. And then every like the day after that is day 2, day 3, day 4. And so every date that exists possibly has an underlying number. And you can think of that like Stata's brain, the way Stata thinks. And that's not very useful, so we can just reformat this. So we go format new date %td. That means we assign a different type for Stata to display these numbers. And now we have a very useful date variable, and we can again check this. In the original this was February 14, 2020, and now after our little procedure here, this is February 14, 2020, so seems to work. So now we clean up, we drop month, day, year, and date. So these three, we just generated them. They contain the substrings. We don't need those anymore. Date is the original date variable. That's a string. We don't need it anymore. And then we're gonna rename new date into date. Okay, we execute those two lines. Control D. There we go. Let's look at the data set now. Okay, now we got rid of this string date variable, and now this enables us to actually use a by command. Okay. Now we get to step 4, which is to compute daily totals. So again, look at the data set. It starts with Aruba in March 2020. It starts with Aruba because it's alphabetic. It's alphabetic at the moment, I think. Yeah. And we don't want to know how many cases and deaths there are in Aruba on 13 March 2020, but we want to know how many cases and deaths there are in the entire world on March 2020, right? Because we want to generate this graph here and this graph here, which is the totals for the world. So what we have to do is that for each date, like for instance 13 March 2020, we have to compute the total of all the cases and the total of all the deaths that we have in all the countries, so we can come up with the total for the world. So the way to do this now is, I will show you another loop. Sorry, I will actually show you the first loop, because here we use the macro, but it's not a loop, because I just used a local macro to store a list of variables, but I didn't loop over that list of variables. So now let's do this. So this is a for each loop, and I will again reference this this local macro called interesting vars. So for each var in interesting vars. Okay, note the accents, so the accent graph and the apostrophe here, because I'm referencing the macro. And then we do this open bracket, and this bracket basically tells data that whatever follows in the space between those two brackets, Stata has to do for each variable in this list of variables. And this list of variables currently contains two variables, total cases and total deaths. Okay. So now for each variable we want to generate the totals per day. So the way to do this is we go by s date. So the by just means for each date, and the s means that Stata, before running the by command, has to sort everything by date. So you cannot run a by command if you haven't sorted the data after the after the variable which you use in the by command. Okay, so by sort date, and then we use egen. This is the command, and this is why I asked you to install the module called egenmore here. So we go egen and then var world. I'm just going to type, and afterwards I'm going to explain what I actually typed. Okay, good. So now that's the first part of the macro. What happens here? So let's go look at this from the inside out. So we start in the bracket. So I tell Stata by each date. Okay, we have a couple of different dates here. By each date, I want you to generate a new variable. That new variable is called var world. And the new variable has to equal the total of var. Okay. So what's var now? So var are just the elements contained in this local macro called interesting vars. Okay. So this basically means that for each of total cases and total deaths. Okay, so first do this for total cases and then do this for total deaths. And what do you have to do, Stata? It's in these brackets. Okay, so think of it like this. First variable, total cases. So for total cases, I want you to generate a variable called total cases underline world, and this variable equals the total of total cases. Okay, so now I run this, Control D, and I get an error message. And why is that the case? It's the case because interesting. You see, we're live here, nothing scripted. So let me find where the error is. So when trying to find out where the error is, I look at what error, where basically, like I look at what's written in here, because the error message appears at the moment at the moment in time where Stata cannot further process the inputs. So I can see here that step 0 went through, 1, 2, 3 went through, and 4 did not go through. So after 4 I get this invalid syntax error. Okay. Oh, okay. I know what I did wrong. So basically here the in is missing. Let's try this, Control D. Yeah. Okay, I did not get any error message now, and more importantly here I see that there are 2 new variables, which is what I wanted. So yeah, that's apologies for that. So if something like this happens, it's always a good idea to also check out the help menu. So in this case the command is for each, so I go help for each, and then here first thing has, so this is syntax, and here it says allowed R. So what's allowed? For each L name, that means local macro name, in any list. Okay, so the in, there has to be an in because we're looping over a list of items, so I have to have the in the command. All right, good, now we got that. So let's look what actually happened. When we open data again, the first thing we notice is that everything's sorted by date now. So the data set now starts, like row 1 is 31st December 19, and then we have all the different countries, but the date is always 31st December 19, and it goes all the way down to 28th April, which is today. Okay. So now here, these are the 2 new variables that we just generated. The first one is called total cases world, and it's simply the sum of the total cases on the 31st of December. So here we have total cases of all the countries. Okay, we are still 31st of December, and here January starts. Okay, so I now highlighted the total cases per country on the 31st of December. And as we saw, there are 0 cases for all countries reported except for China. There are 27 cases for China reported on the 31st of December. So that means if China is the only country that has reported cases, then in this case China is the entire world, so the total cases have to be 27, which is exactly what we get. And total deaths is 0 for that day, which makes sense because we have no countries reporting any deaths. Actually, when is the first death reported? Scroll down. Oh, there's one here. Okay. So, no, there's already one before. So on 13 January. No, already on 12, 11, 10. Okay. So total deaths are 0 on January 10. And then they changed to 1 on January 11. So on January 11, we sadly have the first death reported in this data set. So if we want to look at where this comes from, we just scroll down, and then at some point it should say a 1, and yeah, it's China again. So here the world total of deaths on January 11 is 1. Yeah, okay. And now if we go all the way down, unfortunately, we see that the total cases in the world is like 2.77 million, and the total deaths is approximately 187,000, and that's for April 2020. Okay. So, if this block isn't clear to you, I suggest try everything out by yourself, step by step. And if it still isn't clear, just leave a comment and I'll try and help you. Okay. Now we get to stay 5. And here we will show now the line graphs. So we will create line graphs. And I'm going to add another line of code here where I create a new local macro called local final vars, and I want this to equal itself plus the newly generated world variable. Okay, it's a little quiz. If you can explain this to me, I'm very interested to hear your explanation. So based on what I told you so far about macros, I think you can figure out what this line does. And I will now draw the line graph, and the command for this one is line, then a reference to this newly generated variable list called local final vars. So line final var, and then I want on the x-axis I want the date. Okay, so let's run this thing through. And I have another error message. Okay, I don't know what's happening today. It has to be the weather. So let's look at this again. That's fine. Here we go. This needs an S, because the name of the macro is final vars. Okay. Control D, and we get this graph. I would say it's a nice graph, but it's not, because the topic is so sad behind it, which is this corona pandemic. But if we just look at the numbers, this looks pretty similar to what we have here. Okay. So this is currently, total case currently around 3 million, total deaths around 200K. So here's 3 million on this line. So we're nearly there. And there's a little decrease here. And this is not that there are no more new infections, but this is just because for the I assume that's my explanation, that for the last few days the data hasn't been completely collected yet by this data source, because obviously it takes so much work to compile this data from so many countries, and so I guess it's just the effect of it's just a kind of a lag. We can actually adjust this, and this is another way for me to show you how macros work. So let's say we want to cut off the last 5 days. Okay, so what we do here is we summarize the date variable. So if I do this, I just type some date. I get here a couple of summary statistics, and I know that the maximum is 22033, which in non-Stata language would be the last date, so 28 April 2020. So the nice thing about the sum command is that it actually stores local macros. So you can type ret li, and then you see what has been stored by this sum command, summarize command. And what we care about is here is the maximum, because this is the most recent date. In this case, it's today. So the maximum you see is stored. It's called rmax, and we can actually reference this number in Stata. So what we do now is we just drop if the date is larger than rmax -2, -5. Just want to cut off the last 5 days, okay? And then we make this line graph again. We comment this out, Control A, Control D, and now we cut off the last 5 days. So if you look at it now, the last date in the data set is 23 April, because we dropped the 5 newest dates. So we dropped those 5 dates where not all data has been compiled yet. All right, and that's it. That's the entire code. So let's just quickly recap what we did. First, we installed some modules. We needed to do that to be able to compute totals. Then we imported the CSV data. We dropped unnecessary data, and here we already did use a local macro, which is called interesting vars, and we put those 2 variables in there. And we dropped everything else. Then we had a little operation here ongoing to bring the date variable to a non-string format, and this was necessary for us to compute the daily totals. The daily totals was a loop over those interesting vars, which we defined up here. Then we drew a line graph here. We figured out it's a bit misleading. So we cut off the last 5 days. Again, using a local macro. This time we just used a stored result, a result that was stored in Stata after running the sum command. Okay, so again, Control All, Control D, and we have the graph. Blue shows total cases world, and purple or violet total deaths world. Now I want to show you one cool thing. So why do we use these local macros? Because it's so flexible. I'm going to show you one thing. If we just look at this data set again, like the raw data set, here you have total cases, that's what we worked with. Also total deaths, we also worked with this. But there's also a variable called total tests. Okay, that's like how many COVID tests were done in the world. So if we want to just look at the tests now, so let's say we also want to graph the tests, the only thing we have to modify in the code is that we have to add total tests to the list that we call interesting vars. Okay, so I only added this one single expression. I go Control A, Control D, And here we go. We now have a graph showing three variables. The green line was added, it's called total tests world. Obviously, more tests were conducted than cases, because not everyone who gets tested is positive. So that adjusted the scale on the left-hand side, which is why this graph looks very different from before. But yeah, as you can see here, we're at about 15 million, like 17.5 million tests. And yeah, so you saw we just added this with one word. We told Stata to add an entirely new variable. What I can also do is I can just only look at total cases. Okay, here I have the graph for only the total cases. Or I could just look at total deaths. These are total deaths. So as you can see, macros, very powerful tool, very strange syntax to get used to. Again, local macros, you need these two symbols. But once you do get used to them, and once you learn how the local macros work, you can do stuff like create variable lists. You can then loop over the variable lists, and it just makes your life generally much easier. So thanks again for tuning in. If you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe. If you liked the video, leave a thumbs up. If you have any questions, just put them down in the comment box, and I'll try and answer soon to you guys. Okay, stay safe, stay at home if possible, and have a good week. Bye.